I'm deeply grateful for all the work and initiative and the material support that made it possible for me to be in Montreal and take part in these events. And thank you for coming. This is a great turnout. There are going to be a couple of short films and some discussion, some comments from me, that is, and then I hope we can move into discussion before too long. I think that's always the most interesting part. 40 years ago, we are now at the 40th anniversary of the events of May 68. The French May would have been right in the middle of the 2 or 3 weeks of unfolding insurrection there, which ended up with 10 million people on strike, the occupations movement, that whole exciting thing that was cut short, essentially, I think most importantly by the left, by the unions, the parties that control the unions. And yeah, I've been on the road somewhat. I know there's been a lot of commentary, what was that all about, and so forth. I've actually only read one article, but it was interesting in itself, I think, in terms of our context here and some of these themes. This was a few days ago, I forget which day, a piece in the New York Times called 40 Years Later, a Would-Be Revolution in Paris is Still a Puzzle. And it's kind of a standard thing, you know. It kind of rehearses much of what a lot of people know who either were around at the time or read about it. But what I thought was interesting is that twice, in a not real long article, it talks about a spirit of anti-industrialism. And I wasn't aware of that. I mean, I wasn't in France at the time, but I don't really remember that being brought up. It's kind of good to hear that. And we know, it's been said many times, that history is written from essentially from the consciousness and from the needs of the present, the people that are writing the history. And I think this is probably a case of that, because there's something going on, there's something afoot. I think another example, last night, in a similar vein, in terms of very recent signs, if you will, and that is at the excellent, I think it's the third annual anarchist drama festival. Yeah. It's a rough translation, I guess. The part, I'm referring to the part by the Committee for the End of the World, which was great. It was so funny. And it ended with a very explicitly anti-civilization wind-up. I mean, how did that happen? You know, I mean, in other words, there's something coming on, and obviously not everybody's thrilled with that. You know, that's making its appearance in different countries in different ways, and there is no one central dogma or program, but what is now commonly called primitivism is emerging. And I think most obviously it's because of the crisis, which is right in our faces in so many ways, in a very stark way. But, you know, we have to, well, we don't have to, but we can think about why are some people so hostile? Why not ask certain questions? Why not add this to the dialogue, to the discourse in society? It seems like it's past due. It seems like it's something that's really needed. But another editor of Green Anarchy magazine, about a week ago, in communication with Noam Chomsky, just for example, our good friend Professor Chomsky said that, and this is a quote, "Anarcho-primitivism is the call for the genocide of billions of people." You know, in other words, not the perhaps unintended consequence of these crazy ideas, but the call for the genocide of billions of people. I mean, they're both just unbelievable, but to say that anarchists want I mean, it's just so incredible that you really wonder what's going on there. I, for example, am a genocidist. I'd never heard that term before, but, well, we want genocide, so we're genocidists, Thank you, Chomsky, and other people here and there, locally and so forth. Yeah, but it's remarkable to me. Some people continue to embrace what has turned out so fucking badly. Domination of nature, civilization, domestication, industrialization, the world that by every day that goes by is more technified, meaning that we're more and more mediated from each other and from the natural world. Mass society, the whole ballgame. Progress with a capital P. I just wonder, have they have no touch with reality? Do they not even ever read the paper? It's quite remarkable. As if we're not in this deepening, totalizing crisis in which inner nature is as remorselessly battered as outer nature. In other words, the personal and social existence is being smacked just as hard as the physical environment. And I'll probably talk about that more tomorrow night instead of... and everybody knows that anyway. There's no reason to go through an endless litany with, perhaps in my case, special attention to the U.S., which is a much more pathological culture. But all of the developed countries, the most developed countries, are the weirdest and the scariest. Japan, U.S., Germany, and so forth. It's something of a measure of that. And that's no accident. But I was in Brazil. That's where I got this shirt, by the way, in February, and I got some excellent literature. Here it is. And when I spoke there, I had the chance to speak there, and I got some of the excellent booklets and so on. And I got this one, and I just held it up and I said, there's no reason for some big lecture. You all know all this stuff, and this says it perfectly. Anyway, this, maybe you can't see this very well, but the graphic shows these people going up this cliff and then plunging over. And it says in Portuguese, we've come this far, we can't go back now. There it is. That kind of wraps it up. Anyway, this first film is from Serbia. It's just 6 minutes long. It's pretty unconventional, and I don't know what you'll make of it. I was in Amsterdam when this was screened, and somebody shouted out, "Amen!" afterwards, and everybody laughed, But just in passing, and I don't know if everybody perceives this as a spiritual approach or not, but I just want to throw out the idea, and I first heard this in Croatia. Somebody said, I think this primitivist thing is at base a spiritual movement. And I said, what do you mean by that? Wow, that sounds interesting, and so, who knows, maybe that's been the missing thing somehow, whatever that means, and surely it means various things to various people. Probably another thing that various people don't like, for that matter. One of the lines I stole from a friend of ours. This story is kind of interesting in itself, I think, because it elaborates just a little on that idea of the picture taken from the moon of the blue Earth, and famous in posters and so on. There was a get-together in Washington State in Olympia at Evergreen College there, and there were a lot of workshops, and people were crossing the campus going from workshop to workshop, and some of us were going to another one. And some people came by and they said, those primitivists are even crazier than we thought. There was a guy in there who said he thought the Earth is flat. And we looked at each other and we said, Ben, you know, our friend. But actually, apparently, kind of reconstructing that, he was talking about banned society. He was talking about a totally decentralized world, a really anti-globalization world, and with reference to people whose society, whose world is maybe 60 or 80 people. Picture that, face-to-face society instead of mass society. Then he was discussing that a little bit, and he said for them, it doesn't matter if it's round or flat. You know, what perspective is that? And you know, linking it to the idea that you have to have an industrialized world to get that ship up there to take that picture. It's not just a nice picture on a poster. It involves the whole thing. You know, the whole reality that we're suffering under, and that we're supposed to ignore in terms of its basis and its drive forward, and what is it that drives it forward? You know, all these questions. And I think that has to do with the other line there that I had. It's about a world that doesn't need running. What kind of a world would that be? It wouldn't be a globalized world. And when we get maybe back down to earth a little bit, and we think about what are we doing as anarchists, what do we represent in terms of the chances for changing things, and how much do we want to change? You get to that. You get to these basic questions, and very specific ones as well. For example, we could ask, what happened to the anti-globalization movement? I mean, a lot of things slowed down after 9/11 and so forth. We could go back and forth about that. But I think one thing that you can point out, and maybe I'm wrong here, but one of the problems with the anti-globalization movement, if we want to call it that, if that's largely what it was, in terms of all Seattle and Genoa and so forth, in the early part of this decade, is that it wasn't anti-globalization. It was never anti-globalization, almost not at all. There were just a few people who were. What I mean is, at these big demos, very commonly, you know, some journalists would come up and stick the microphone in the nearest protester's face and say, "Why are you against globalization?" and want something for the evening news or whatever. And they'd say, "We're not against globalization. We're against corporate globalization. We want the nice, bottom-up, warm and fuzzy globalization." Oh, okay, well that's one answer, except how does that work? It's still globalization. It's still a matter of, in the US anywhere, where the food travels an average of over 2,000 kilometers from where it's grown to where it's consumed, and that distance is growing. You know, and what do you have to do to make that happen, for example? And that's a positive thing, generally speaking. Everybody would like to have some grapes from southern Chile in February or something. You know, of course, why not? Oh, well, what's the cost of that? What does that mean? What does it mean to the people that are producing it? What does any part of it mean? What does it mean now that China is in hyperdrive with globalization, and you get million-ton plumes of pollution that are falling now in Western North America? You got thousands of coal miners that give it up every year to feed the machine, to feed industrialization. You've got to have that. You don't have the technology without the industrialization. You can't see across the street in some eastern cities in China. The rivers are poisoned. We know all this. And India, by the way, is right on their heels. You know, and everybody, that's just the name of the game. I was in Turkey a month or two ago, and I heard this guy saying, we've got a lot of catching up to do, you know, in terms of development. Well, in the suicide derby, you do have a lot of catching up to do. You can catch up to the point where then you'll have a society where kids go to school and kill each other, like in the U.S. And of course there are great cultural differences. This is not a gun-mad country up here compared to the U.S., but there's no real reason to think that's not going to come, insofar as the modernity mass society keeps on rolling, and you get more and more industry and technology. It's just cancer that spreads. What would stop that? First of all, problematizing it. saying it's not just automatic or inevitable or like the sun coming out. It only is if people accept it that way. Well, anyway, this one, as I said, I think is about 23 or 24 minutes. It's much more straightforward, and it covers some of the angles of the contemporary questions like peak oil and so forth, but from an anti-civ spin, very definitely. I don't want to talk about this too much. I'd rather kind of move on to discussion. But I would like to say that I think this film is pretty good, but I also feel it's kind of anti-civ light. I mean, it glosses over a whole lot, and you know, in 24 minutes, that's the way that goes, I guess. But you know, I think there were parts of it that need to be paid more attention to. For example, when Jared Diamond and many others observe how civilizations collapse, and the whole point about domestication being the worst mistake that the species ever made, you know, it really is about institutions. It's much easier to say, sort of vaguely, well, we have to change our values and this and that, and you know, that to me, unfortunately, that slides too easily into greenwashing. We want to be green, we want to be sustainable, and we're cool, and we recycle, and the whole thing kind of just slips away. It really doesn't work that way. And you know, what surprises me also to some degree is that people on the left, who you would think to look to for a discussion of social institutions, are the ones that are avoiding that. For example, the most fundamental one is division of labor, is specialization. And that pushes the whole thing forward from the very beginning to right now. Ask any economist. What drives the world system forward, the economy? It's ever more division of labor. And if that's just ignored and pretend it's just an invisible thing and you've got nothing to do with that, it's parallel with the other one. And I think division of labor gets to a certain point, where it did in the story of the species and the havoc that's been wrought. It gets to the point of domestication. I think that's the only plausible explanation, or maybe it's just a guess. It sets the stage for that place at which, pretty much simultaneously and not that long ago, that great mistake was made. That shift to control, that shift to domination, that shift away from accepting what nature gives, what the earth gives. And then everything changes. Everything changes. Civilization comes in right after that, and the whole thing goes crazy. Civilization is chronic war. I mean, all the things that we know. You have to go back and look at those institutions. You can we can talk about the psychological denial that's so immense, and that's worth talking about too. But it really is a matter of these institutions and that's the sticky thing. That's why Richard Heinberg and so many other people would rather just imagine a nice collapse. Or not so nice, but nice in the sense that the agency question is taken care of. It's going to fail. It's going to crash. It's going to fall. And that gets back to the question of the die-off. As Chomsky and other people claim, that people that want a primitive future as the only possible future are talking about the die-off of billions of people. Well, you know, I've seen those tower blocks in Sao Paulo or Istanbul, and all those people, they don't even have a tiny garden. They're going to be dead in 3 or 4 days if it falls. And so it could be an error, it could be a failure, a kind of ethical failure, an intellectual failure, and I think it is, to say, well, collapse is coming. And Heinberg in particular, and I've talked to him about this, you can have this illusion that it will fall. Well, how about making it fall? Or in other words, how about stepping in there and getting to work on it, doing the dismantling and breaking the dependency and starting out of the cities and questioning all these things that make so many people, of course the people on the bottom, the most vulnerable. Those are the ones that are going to die in the millions. People just imagine that cities are eternal. They're not eternal. And it's time to face that and all of the connectedness involved. And I'm jamming a lot together here, but I think that is really worth thinking about. And just another word on domestication, or another couple of words on both of those two institutions. The question of class society, a favorite of Marxists, obviously. It's interesting, though, that Marx originally was talking about the means of production or technology more. What is the nature of that, and what does it do to people? And I think a very important point there is that when the subject begins to be divided into roles, economic roles, and reduced in that way, class society follows almost immediately. The divided self, the divided society. So you have to go way back there if you want to talk about class society. In other words, I think primitivism in many ways is a deepening of class theory or Marxist theory. And some of these, the greatest contributors, Stanley Diamond and a whole host of others, are Marxists. I mean, they don't want to get to the same conclusions perhaps, but they do know that these institutions are very, very primary. And the question of domestication, just one or two things quickly on that. One of the things I think about from time to time, and which still holds up all the more, is what Freud wrote 80 years ago, Civilization and Its Discontents, that old standard, which isn't paid attention to enough. And he basically said it was really domestication and its discontents. And he said the more civilization you get, the more unhappy and neurotic people are going to be. It's kind of amazing for somebody who is so conservative and bourgeois and opted for civilization. But he did realize and had the honesty to say that it's a wound that never heals. You can break a horse, you can agriculture, domestication of animals and plants, that whole story. Well, when you do that with humans, and maybe many other species, I don't know, I'm not sure about that, but that's not a happy bargain. But as Freud put it, you don't have people working or producing symbolic culture until you break them. Until you break them just like you break the horse. Until domestication comes in. Then you can have fine art and everything which we all enjoy. But what is the price for that? What is the price for that? You have to, I suggest anyway, go back to re-examining that. So all the talk about values and we need a shift and so forth, well, what is the shift? If you don't, it's still a blind imperative. We can still scratch our heads. Why do civilizations go like that and then go off the cliff? You know, and everybody can see it. Spengler, a horrible guy on the right, said this planet will be in time a graveyard because that's what civilization does. It destroys everything. Everybody knows that. But nobody wants to apply it. And these, of course, what is called primitivism is way more a series of questions than a series of answers. Nobody I know pretends to have a lot of very handy answers, that's for sure, to put it mildly. But it's time, in the face of this crisis, to really come to grips with what produces it, and we'll continue to guarantee that things will get worse until that is interrupted, until that's short-circuited, until the plug is pulled on those institutions. And that doesn't happen until they're politicized, until they become problematic. And I don't know if that's going to happen, but if it did happen, it might unlock everything. And not in some simple way or magic bullet way, but at least the beginning of figuring out what is a life of health and freedom and that will endure, as it did for 2 million years. When you think of people cooking with fire 1.9 million years ago, possibly older than that, they had the intelligence. That's a whole anthropological thing there, but it was very, very recently that they made that turn, and it didn't take long to relatively speaking, to get to where we're at now, with time running out. Well, anyway, I thank you for listening. I've jammed more together, probably mashed it together worse than the film, but Anyway, if we want to get into some discussion and Q&A.
Period also, so anybody who wants to ask questions, go ahead, and I'll try to pick up who's speaking and who wants to ask questions. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's more actually just a couple of comments, and then I'd definitely invite you to respond. Just about a couple of contradictions or a little bit of critique that I noticed. And I probably wouldn't have even brought this up except for at the end of the video. The expression that was used at the very beginning is an indigenous expression from northern Papua New Guinea. And it just so happens that tonight in another room in UQAM, in the other part of UQAM, there are indigenous leaders from Papua New Guinea, from that very region. That's his first language. A Diagisa leader from Chile and an Aboriginal elder from Australia, speaking about their personal experiences and their community struggles against mining. And so I just find the contradiction a little bit interesting. You sort of speaking about the same general global themes here, but referring to Marx and these other global thinkers, which is kind of like the picture of the Earth from outer space, versus them as community leaders dealing with their very local day-to-day face-to-face struggles on the same issues. So that was one thing. And then the second thing, sort of on the same note, was just if you wanted to comment a bit about the use in the video of all of these video clips from Baraka and of indigenous societies around the world, but at the same time, I don't actually know all the people the voices we heard in the video, because it's often just the voices. But the people that we do see are all white men. So, there's this discussion of sort of going back to band society, but could you maybe address specifically indigenous people and comment on these two sort of contradictions? Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That's another contradiction we have, that's for sure. I mean, we say, and I think we're sincere, that the touchstone for us, the inspiration, is indigenous wisdom. And yet, we're in this Eurocentric mode. I guess one way to describe it is the books are written by people who are not indigenous. That's something that should be paid attention to, and it gets glossed over like a lot of other things. Especially in a short film, there's all these images, and people get to have these sound bites, and then it's over, and you get a nice little picture at the end of some unnamed indigenous people somewhere, and it's not that. I think that's an extremely important point. We have some connections with some Native American indigenous people, but not very much directly. I could talk about that slightly, because it's only slightly, and it's not the actual people right now and their struggles. That would be worth talking about. But it's that's a very good point. That there's.
Or is that first question? There should be a positive discussion.
Right, you're being critical. And I'm sorry, what the other part? What was the?
Oh, they were both basically on the same thing. The first one was just, it's just the same contradiction, just because of the fact that tonight there's actually somebody who speaks that language who's talking about their own community struggle. And so even in sort of your analysis about how we need this face-to-face community, you're referring to Marx and other global thinkers as opposed to referring to actual local communities.
Right. Well, I was referring to Marx more as a failure, not as a model, but that I think some of the most stunning stuff for me, for example, last year in Utah, the youth elder, and of course there are a lot of differences culturally, to put it mildly, in terms of style and everything else, but he said, among other things, civilization is the ending of the indigenous condition. And how much better could you put it? Or at least that's a very, I thought, a very powerful way of putting it. And those discussions were amazing. And it isn't the academic stuff or the usual mode, that's for sure. It's how do we get more of that? There's some Native folks who refer to us as neo-primitivists, which is, you know, that, I mean, there's a lot of different words or names, and but if we can enlarge that into direct listening, but you know, and it's also true, it's not any good, it's not respectful to lump any indigenous group together. In other words, there are certainly divisions among, you know, there can be native groups. Some spokesperson is, you know, all in favor of development, for example, and that's, of course, there's different takes, the way they see it, and struggles within those communities, obviously too. You can't just say, well, that's the indigenous voice, and certainly you weren't saying that, but that's another part of it. You know, one example that shows how difficult that is post-Katrina New Orleans. And a lot of people, including a lot of anarchists, including people I know, went down there to help. There was severe need. But at the same time, when does the perspective enter the picture, especially in that one, a city built below sea level, built at the cost of all the wetlands being destroyed so they can keep propping up that city, which is a very cool place, I'm sure. I haven't even ever been there, but you know what I mean? That's not the ultimate answer. It's not the ultimate answer. I mean, I'm very glad, and I certainly respect people who went down there for months to try to give a hand and be involved in those projects for people that lost everything. Of course, you know, but is that the thing to just keep on? At some point, that's failing. That isn't maybe ultimately in the best interest of people there or anybody else. You know, in terms of what is the real possible road out of there.
Spreading information might be one of the best things to do that?
Yeah, and well, a lot of things. You know, a lot of things. There are people on the land that are trying to figure out how do we feed each other. You know, I mean, how, especially if you take seriously the non-domestication direction. And fortunately, there are a lot of people. I know very, very little about that, but there are many places with permaculture or Fukuoka's methods or indigenous edible landscapes, as some people call it. What did they used to eat here, and how can that be healed again, or how can we aid in that process, and instead of the monoculture poisoning the earth model and all that? I mean, that's the practical thing that has to be done. Otherwise, there's no place to go.
But do you think it would be possible to go back to the philosophy of when they come le siècle des Lumières, you know, like Jean-Jacques Rousseau, le contrat social, or Thomas Jefferson, you know, that kind of philosophy where knowledge or science was put in much before money or economy. Do you think it would be possible to go back to? It was at the end of the 18th century, you had Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Voltaire, Isaac Newton, Thomas Jefferson, Immanuel Kant, and these people. Do you think that it would be a middle way?
Well, there could. I mean, maybe that's what will happen. Who knows? I mean, that just depends on what is decided, if we get to decide. But it seems to me, again, as I didn't say perhaps very well, but if you don't short-circuit that process, you're only putting it off. It just keeps going at a slightly earlier stage, which wouldn't be so bad, but it wouldn't perhaps be the answer that establishes life on a non-domesticated, non-divided way. I mean that's talking about ideal futures or directions or goals. I mean, this would probably be a very difficult process of transition to get to anywhere, you know. But but maybe we have to have that vision in order to, you know, somehow get outside of all these things.
This is along similar lines of the first commentary also, because I was also pretty appalled by the ending of that film, especially with the usage of a deep forest, which is probably one of the worst cases of cultural appropriation. And I don't know much about the ethics behind the video footage, but I wouldn't give them much but my question is, what do you think is the role of this glorification of the noble savage in this movement? Do you think that there's some positive role there, or is this a problem within the movement of anarcho-progressivism?
Well, that's a pejorative. I mean, that's the kind of laugh line, noble savage. We're way too hip for that. But of course it is. That's exactly the point. Civilization has tried to just deride that, but I mean that's. A condition where there wasn't organized warfare, where women were not systematically objectified, where man society was egalitarian, that's orthodox anthropology. That isn't dreaming. It was until somewhat recently, but now that's what you get in basic 101 anthropology. That's not some anarchist cooking it up, or Rousseau or anybody else. I don't think. I think it's sometimes there's the pull to idealize or romanticize, but you don't really have to do that. I mean, the record is pretty good in itself, not perfect. I mean, and so much we don't even know. We don't know very much about personal violence before civilization. We know there wasn't war, but you can't even. You could make a rosy picture about some things that there's no evidence for if you want, but there's plenty of evidence for a very sound basis of life compared to this one, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, I agree with that on that level, but is it really worth exploiting people who are already exploited so much is basically my question.
Well, yeah, no, that's a hard one. I mean, anybody with dreadlocks, any pop music is ripping off cultures to feed into the metropole, into modern societies like this one. I mean, I don't know exactly what to say about that. I mean, where do you draw the line? I mean, do you not have that at all? Maybe not. I mean, I don't know, but it isn't just, I don't know. It's a problem that exists in a very widespread way, not how somebody makes a kind of a slick film real fast and then throws it in. I mean, I'm not disagreeing with you, but you know what I mean? It's a pretty big problem, I guess.
I have two quick questions. The first one you can answer by yes or no, I don't mind. The first question is, do you think 911 was an inside job? And the second, well, I'm just curious by your opinion. And the second question, and then you can go.
No.
No, okay.
I don't know, but that's...
Well, that's a defining point. I mean, it creates a separation on the left, because you have those 911 truth movements, and they're divided between Ron Paul and Kucinich, and they're still pretty, they have something to do.
I mean, I guess it's possible. My main hit on that is there are people... I don't know what accounts for it, but there's so many sidesteps, endless conspiracy stuff.
Well, those people look at history,
Well,
when you look at history, you get quite
why not look at more basics? Why not look at the institutions rather than was there a plot to kill Kennedy or? I mean, there's a billion of them. I mean, and in a sense, what does it matter? What changes? Whoever killed Kennedy, does it make any difference in your life or my life or the life of the planet?
I think it does, because we're fighting for public opinion, right? We're fighting.
But over what? You're fighting over nothing. I mean, who cares?
Well, it does matter.
Does it?
Yeah.
It doesn't matter to me.
You're not in public office.
I'm sure you know way more about it. I'm just suggesting that that's kind of a big diversion. We could be thinking about more important things.
You're also fighting for public opinion right now, and you're spreading information. But okay, you answered my question. It's fine. My second question is a little maybe more. Do you see any alternative to money as an organizational system of society? And if you do, what would be the best?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because it leads on to, I don't know how many, everybody's an anarchist, probably not, or the question, in other words, the question of, in terms of primitivism, just one quick reference to the tradition of the left, let's say. We are against capital, we're against the state, we don't need this loony primitivist stuff because we got it covered by being against capital and the state. Okay, and now how can you explain that you want to get rid of the state, but you want to keep all this stuff. That's why you're not a primitivist, let's say, crudely, okay? Well, without layers and layers of government, all this stuff would stop in maybe, I don't know, 12 hours or something. I mean, you can't get rid of the state just by words and preserve all this stuff. It just simply doesn't work that way. And the other part relating to what you brought up is similar. Maybe it's slightly trickier, but capitalism, if you want all this stuff and you don't want capitalism, there's actually no way when you think about it to do that. There really isn't. The closest thing that I'm aware of, maybe somebody has some other ideas on this, but it's Michael Albert Perricon idea. It's a participatory economy where basically, maybe there's a little unfair, but basically everybody goes to about 1 million meetings every month, and you have the most massive bureaucracy that you could imagine. But because you can figure out consumption and production and everything, but without money, and I'm not arguing for capitalism, don't get me wrong, but that's why you have money. You don't have to go to 1 million meetings. You know what I mean? I mean, I'm putting it very simply, but...
What about binary economics?
Binary?
Yeah.
I don't know what that is.
Kelso, you're not familiar with...
Is that a barter idea? Or?
It's a large idea, yeah.
A what?
Binary economics. Never heard of
I'm
it?
sorry, I don't know.
Quite popular.
Oh, sorry, I don't know.
Search.
Okay. Just ask you, it occurred to me from watching the second film that if people are faced with a breakdown in industrial society, like they talked about, loss of peak oil and a collapse of the global economy because of low availability of energy, let's say, that people will have to be able to respond at a grassroots level in such a way to defend themselves from the after effects. And I'm wondering if you know of any people who are like trading skill sets or trying to train themselves to get along in a situation where government power doesn't exist anymore, or where it does, and it's like pointing a gun at you. Because I'm wondering, you know, by that film, it looks like it's not going to be too long down the road before we're dealing with like a food deal coming down.
Yeah?
Yeah.
We don't know. It could be just a degraded lower level or a sudden collapse. Derek Jensen seems to think it'll be sudden because it's so completely interdependent, and you know, one satellite goes down, it ripples through the whole thing, and you get big problems. I mean, nobody knows. But yeah, that's exactly part of it, like the people on the land. Survival or primitive skills, and you know, that's, I mean, all kinds of people are doing that. You got CEOs that jet out to some school in the Northwoods or something, and they have a good time doing something, you know, making a little knife or something. But you know, but seriously, that is something that, I mean, people were skilled to live in the world. Either gender could make stone tools, and you didn't need an expert. You didn't need a whole system of stuff. You could just do it, and do what you needed to do with it. And they knew how to do that, and you know, we have to recover those skills. We have to recover our sensual acuity, our robusticity that we've lost by being so in the cocoon of all the techno-cultural mediations and everything. We're all dependent on all these things, including me, for sure. Some people are, you know, are learning those things, and they can be learned, you know. Well, we are sure enmeshed in all this division of labor right now. I mean, for example, referring to the literature of anthropology or ethnography or archaeology, those are specialties, that's for sure, you know. Or even, or the rest of it. I mean, some of it is very obvious, but how do we know exactly what's happening to the Earth? I mean, how do we know what's happening to the oceans? I mean, there are scientists who do that. I mean, and we partake of their knowledge, and yes, there is a needed critique of those bourgeois specializations, and we can't keep going with that. But I think we do have to use, what we can learn, no matter what the source is right now, I guess. Is that what you meant? That there is an authoritarian part, for sure. I agree. Maybe we can move out of that. Science is not just the science that's taught. I mean, for the purposes of modernity, it's also when somebody in the Kalahari Desert can see a blade of grass that's bent like this, many meters away, we couldn't even see it. But they can not only see it and know what it means, know what's about to bloom, or know where the water is, or know where the animals are. I mean, that's way past science, in terms of intimate knowledge of reality. There's that science, and maybe we can get to that, and be there and do that sort of thing.
Yes?
Me?
Yep.
Alright, first, I'm very disappointed because the videos you showed mean nothing. They're totally meaningless. They prove nothing. The facts are flawed. But furthermore, the message of the movies are civilization is at an end. But I don't think so, and we know that it will not. For example, after the Roman Empire fell, capitalism had a chance to grow out of grassroots because not the cuts, but anyway, the barbarians, after they destroyed the Roman Empire, they just rebuilt out of agriculture and thrived, and they became the most powerful civilization after that, the modern Western civilization. Furthermore, even during the Middle Ages, after 2/3 of the Occidental, the Western people died out of Black Plague, we grew up, we went back to power after that, even so. You understand?
I don't know the point of that, of course.
I'll go on. Sorry. I'll try to express myself.
No, I see what you're saying, but yes,
You're talking about massive die-offs.
What's the dispute?
The dispute is, your argumentation is based on the world is at an end because we cannot sustain our current mode of production, right?
Well, I would say it's more likely that the die-off is going to come because of this machine.
Exactly. So
you've heard about what's going on with the biosphere. You've heard about the massive extinction of species and the poisoning of everything. I mean, or did you not get that?
I do know, but you're saying there will be a die-off.
No, if I were saying that, I wouldn't bother to try to make any contribution. It would be pointless. I mean, I think we have the chance to do something about it. In other words, I'm not a collapsist. That's another strange term that was sometimes tried to be applied to primitivists. You're just passive, waiting for the collapse, and that's not where I'm at all.
So
it might not even collapse, and even if it doesn't collapse, it's still the better road to go.
What do we do? How do we prevent power, armies, capitalists, bourgeois to take power and gain control? Even if 70% of the people died, like in the Middle Ages, what will prevent these powerful people to continue their way of living in a new way, as the same as they did before?
Well, maybe
how could we prevent them and live in a primitivist society?
Well,
and even after that, even after they polluted every river, they fished every fish, they killed every animal on Earth, they destroyed the biosphere, how could we sustain a life in a primitivist society with no more sustainable environment? It's impossible.
Well,
So
right, but
useless.
you might be able to say that in a lot of ways the onus is on the other side, in effect, because, for example, when people say, and I hope this is pertinent to what you just said here, but the people that want to preserve everything, keep it going this way, and pretend like it's going to keep on going and not continue to savage everything at every level, have the question of, as a friend of mine in Detroit always used to say, do you want to go down in the mines? And people would go, what? And he would say, I'm not going down in the mines unless you put a gun to my head. Okay, so, and if nobody goes down in the mines, you don't have industrialism, you don't have technology, you're primitive. And to use that word is a word, that's a WordPress, but you know what I mean? In other words, how do you get people down in the mines? This is a problem especially for anarchists. You know, how do you coerce people to get into the mines? Obviously now, it's almost all economic. They don't do it for fun. You know, it's dangerous, it's awful, I mean, who would want to spend even an hour down there? But for the people that want all this stuff, and I don't know if that includes you, you want to go down the mines? And the smelters, the foundries, the assembly lines, the warehouses, all of that grunt work that wastes people's lives? I don't. So, in other words, it's their problem. I mean, I'm not saying it's that simple, but, you know, and even if you look at it practically, it's not necessarily such a crushing problem. Something like 35% of the cops in New Orleans didn't come to work after Katrina. They can't even count on that. I mean, I'm not saying that's some big utopian deal, but they didn't. Other cops were sort of out. You know, they didn't come. For whatever reason, they're bailing out their house or whatever, but they're not running down looters or something. They're not doing anything for the state. So, you know, you have to, if you want to control all this stuff, we know how it operates now, but what if you didn't have money to pay the army and the cops? What if that stopped?
We don't need money in the cops. We don't need money in the cops.
Well, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying.
We don't need to go back to primitive society.
Excuse-moi, un dialogue à deux, il y a beaucoup d'autres questions.
But it doesn't answer my question. It doesn't answer anything.
Il y a d'autres questions aussi. Si vous voulez discuter plus tard, il y a peut-être l'occasion aussi. There may be occasions after to discuss, but person behind, yeah. Go ahead.
It was just an observation you were saying about the collapse of cities, and basically a few years after the Soviet Union collapsed, I was in Ukraine. I was visiting there, and it was just from observing that, you know, I was in Revolve, I was in Kiev, and I had relatives out on the farms, and it was just a huge difference seeing my relatives who were out on their own little farms, part of the former large state farms. They had food to eat, they were able to eat just enough, you know, to put some meat on the table after the winter and such, whereas my relatives in the cities were basically starving. And that was just already with the collapse of benzene. There was very little transport of fuel available. Police were underpaid. Teachers are heavily underpaid there. Bread was barely able to get to the table. Vodka problem, which was a huge riot issue, but, you know, and just seeing from there, just that happening after the collapse of the communist system within Ukraine, and of course Moldavia and all the other places, but it was just interesting seeing from there. And so if you're saying, you know, after the collapse of peak oil and such, how it's going to happen here with what we've got to, you know, I mean, there is a problem. But, and we're talking in Eastern Europe where even in like a city like Kiev where everybody owns a little house or something, people are gardening there. People have cows, people have chickens in the city. They have their goats, they have a horse if they don't own if they're too poor to own a vehicle in Ukraine. And so it's, I guess you could say, a rural city, if you will, but I mean it's a big city nonetheless. And there's a lot of agriculture still around in cities, but yet people still had problems feeding themselves, and there were a lot of suicides at the time when I was there.
Yeah, thank you.
What's that happening there?
Je n'ai pas compris, jeter dans le quoi?
Si ce n'est pas civilisationnel, je veux bien être jeté dans le
Wants to be thrown down the well.
If it isn't civilizational project, I'd rather be thrown into the river.
Et donc moi j'ai la très désagréable impression qu'il se sert de l'anarchie pour avoir une espèce de caution.
I think he's serving, you're using anarchism to like have a backing, a kind of...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Une espèce de caution politique ou sociale ou avoir une audience.
Social or political backing and to get an audience.
Je suis désolé de la brutalité des propos.
I'm sorry for the reality of what I'm saying.
Okay, well, I'm an anarchist because I subscribe to the project of identifying and trying to do something about domination. Apparently you think factories are not dominating, and the crisis of the eco-catastrophe that's coming very close is not dominating, and the ever-increasing domination of nature, which domestication starts with agriculture and goes all the way to nanotechnology and cloning and all that Brave New World stuff, that's not dominating.
When you talk about Africa, we are in a situation where we never had primitive thoughts, but our own African tradition thoughts. I don't call that primitive thoughts. And we were important questions of industrialization when we didn't ask for it. And now we have to address the issue of returning to primitive thinking when we actually never left our African traditions, but now we have to deal with Western questions. So as someone who's interested in anarchy theories, although I am African, that's my theory, I would like to know if, don't you think that there's a need of pacing in terms of returning to the primitive, or maybe a need of reframing this returning to primitive for the other societies, non-Western societies? I mean, we remain who we are, but we were imported another system, and now we have to answer to the same question of a society that imported that system, when we know that it's never been our situation. So according to what you're saying, what should we do as non-Western people?
Thank you for that, because that really highlights the point. I mean, I made some general points and general questions, but there is no universalizing to be done. That would just repeat the whole problem in the first place of imposing some kind of pattern or anti-development. That's as far as I get it anyway, one of the most splendid things about indigenous wisdom. It's not. It is grounded in the earth and in life ways that have that maintain traditions, or try to maintain traditions in the face of everything that's tried to crush that and pave it over and everything. So, I mean, all I can say is that's a pretty profound point. That's a very different situation than in some other countries. You know?
Yeah, I mean, just to conclude the point that I was trying to make is that by the time the first civilization rose in Africa, with the Egyptian civilization, the civilization survived for thousands and thousands of years because of the principles that they believed in. But at the moment the Greeks entered the Egyptian kingdom and started to learn from the Egyptian priests about their wisdom and knowledge and returned that to Greece, then these Greek thinkers started saying that philosophy was born in Greece in the 5th century before BC. So then when we're saying that civilization is not you specifically, but viewing civilization as anti-human progress in the sense that there's no way to return back to the real roots of humanity, I'm saying, but when it was the case for these people, the Egyptians, they actually lived on civilization, and it's because in another civilization this perception was already there, that now this is what we have, but it's not the case for everybody. I mean, we Africans need to find a way to return back to our civilization. We need to find a way to teach that in world history, because it's not African history, it's world history. And when all of these different approaches to history will be paralleled in a proper way, then we can talk about changing civilization and returning to whatever primitive way. But until this didn't happen to other civilizations, we cannot talk about, bringing down civilization. I mean, we have our questions also that need to be answered first.
I see.
So that's the point I'm trying to make.
I see.
There's a person in the back. You, I think, had a question. There's going to be 2 people left, and there's a 3rd person after, and then if the people are right, we'll close the speaker. You want a 4th person? Okay. 5th person, I guess. All right. We'll just try to go with that. That'll be the end.
You just mentioned that
Louder.
You just mentioned that factories are domination and other forms like technology is domination, but I don't necessarily see how anarcho-criticism is going to help folks require forms what you call domination. For instance, hearing. For instance, wheelchairs. For instance, like these are things that folks need to be able to have access to space, to public space, to private space. So how would you address that? Like address different disabilities? I just don't see if we go to this like collapse in this. I feel like the whole like collapsing. I feel like the people that are gonna die off are gonna be the ones who are the most marginalized. It's gonna be the people of color. It's gonna be the trans folk. It's gonna be the disabled folk, and all the white middle class hetero men are gonna be like, oh, yeah, not middle class because there's no class anymore, but all the like white men, hetero, are gonna be like, oh, well that's like, yay, we don't have to die off because everyone else is gonna die off first. Like, I don't know.
Well, that's the reality right now. That's for sure. I mean, if there's a collapse, then that's the sad answer to that. That's what pulls the plug on the person with the respirator to breathe. I mean, that's a hell of a tough one. I mean, but I think, you know, some of the perspective that bears on that actually, though, is what is it that causes a lot of these diseases and conditions in the first place? You know, in other words, I mean, that's easy to, I'm not just passing a wand over it to make it go away, but it's true. You know, that's all the technology and so forth that is always promising the answer so many times. It's a huge part of what caused the problem in the first place. You know, for example, I mean, this is tricky. This is kind of would involve a lot, I grant you, but there were really no infectious diseases or degenerative diseases before domestication. Kind of amazing, but there's quite a literature on that which says exactly that. Because you didn't have drudge work. You know, you didn't have people jammed together so that plagues and stuff could start. They were dispersed, so you didn't have that kind of dynamic of infectious disease. You had virtually none of it, and that too sounds like just dreaming up some anarchist fantasy. Well, it's not. It's simply not. I mean, you can go and check it out. So, but as you say, there definitely are people right now who are dependent. They're diabetic mainly because of the mass fast food, shit food that's encircling the world and making people, you know, go in that direction. Processed food and all the rest of it. That isn't a condition of. It's not a natural eternal condition. That can be changed so that, you know, then people are healthier. I mean, that's at least part of the answer. Because otherwise you're stuck with, we can never change anything because some people are sick. Well, and I don't know what the answer to that is. I mean, some people say, and I don't know if I agree, but some people say, well, is that enough to anchor everybody else to the end of the world? I mean, that's a rough way to put it. I'm not so sure I subscribe to that. But, you know, if the conclusion is because people are dependent on technology now to stay alive, if at all costs we've got to maintain the technology and it ruins everything else, you know what I mean? That's a tough question too. You know, how would you answer that?
That puts you in a pretty privileged position to be able to say that, yeah.
Well, I know some people actually that would, I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know if I'm not in that position, but I think some people would say, I don't know if I want to be maintained artificially at the cost of everything else, you know, and I'm putting it in an exaggerated way, but what do you do with that problem? I don't know.
There's just another final comment. I guess this is, I hear this line so many times, cut it over and over again, the division of labor, but when it's touted by white men, it's never, there's never the racialized division of labor or gendered division of labor. It's always the division of labor, division of labor. So once we get rid of the division of labor, then all other things in society are going to be gone. We don't have to deal with racism when class is done. We don't have to deal with sexism when class is done.
Well, that's right, and that's false. But I can tell you there's a lot of indigenous people who say that, not just white middle-class people like me. They are trying to see that their indigenous culture doesn't get steamrolled over and homogenized and standardized out of existence. Those are the people that really know. I mean, and that's where we started noticing this, not from privileged white men somewhere. What is going on with those people who don't want to be part of the machine. I mean, we're supposed to believe that they all want to shop at Walmart, and the hell with their life ways and their traditions. Well, you know, that doesn't take much to figure out that's a lie. So it's you know, they have something to say about that much more than we do, and you know, and they may have the same conclusion. You know.
Question here.
I just want to discuss a little bit on division of anarchist radical groups, ecologists, because in 78, Murray Bookchin of the second Congress of environmental movement in the United States tells that primitivists and deep ecology, that's what they foment, and people who try to own the idea of anti-civilization, tells that it can be very dangerous to put message on population, on anti-civilization and primitivist, and tell that maybe we need more a human project that we can own by ourselves and decentralize to get what we can all construct together. And I see primitivist, little...
What human project?
Human project like libertarian municipalists, or how you can decentralize, and I don't see on primitivist collective participatory initiative that can take place.
We don't want to keep running the same old shit. We want it to go away. We're not interested in self-managing all of these alienated things. He was.
You are not on collective autonomy and how...
Collective autonomy, isn't that an oxymoron?
You think? I don't think so, because here in Quebec, we talk a lot about it because our agriculture goes very bad, and it looks like a little like United States, but not yet. And farmers peasants try to get together to how they can learn each other and how we can make sustainable community. Still up, I don't know if it will, but how we can regroup together to show alternative. And I don't see alternative in the primitive movement. I just see a result or consequences of the crisis. But we cannot go to a consequences. We should take alternative to make our own alternative.
Well, but there has to be a real alternative, not just an adjustment within the system and cover it over with rhetoric. You know, Bookchin was great at that. He would just blind people with rhetoric. But what do you want and what do you not want? Let's get down to specifics. You know, you can cut through that, and then people can decide. Maybe they don't want this idea or that idea, but at least you know what you're talking about. You know, do you want the factories? Yes or no? And you can say, oh, collective autonomy, blah, blah, blah. That means nothing to me. I mean, that just is more political double talk. You gotta, you know, break it down. Let's talk about specific institutions. You know, you can write about urbanization without cities, black without white, or up versus down. Or, you know, that really is not gonna cut it. I'm sorry, I just don't have. And then the guy ends up as a Leninist on top of it, and that shows where a lot of that really, he was covering it over with a lot of nice sounding stuff, but it was crap.
I understand what you said, but people's own idea exists by themselves, and you can like figure this idea to keep it the way you want, but it's dangerous to let this idea running a little, because people will own it and make it, maybe, I don't know.
Well, we can't control, we don't want to control anything. I mean, that's, but the questioning, the critique has to be done, and people will decide what direction they want to go. There's no, everybody needs to be involved. I mean, and I'm sorry I was so crude about Murray Bookchin, but yeah, there's no possibility. That's another reason I'm an anarchist. I don't want any control. I don't want to engineer anything. I mean, but we do have to face some good questions, or questions that just are here. You know, whether we like it or not. You know, and rhetoric isn't going to solve them.
Vas-y. Votre question brièvement, oui. Oui, allez-y.
What is the effect of the private societies like the Bohemian Club and the Stars and Bones? I mean, they are the one, I guess, that are pushing us towards the cliff. It's not everybody in the society. A lot of people, they don't know what they do, but somebody is pushing them. You probably know about this group. One of the group of Women Club is not very far from Oregon.
Well, yeah, the ruling class has all these elite clubs, and it doesn't matter who's in office either, whether they belong to this club or that club. It's the same racket. It's the same. They endorse every single basic institution and every other institution for that matter, whether it's Obama or whoever. What does it matter what club they're in? They're part of. Their interests are very different from that of the rest of us and the other species and the other things that are trying to live on this planet.
Yes. Sir, at some point tonight you said something about how you cannot get people to do something symbolic unless you break them. Do you remember that?
Oh, the domestication thing?
Yes. Can you repeat that and elaborate a little bit?
Well, that's we wonder how that happened. I mean, how did they pull it off? And it's interesting to note, and I'm glad I get a chance to maybe flesh that out a little bit more, that it was a huge struggle. It was a bloody struggle. As Stanley Diamond in Search of the Primitives, a very good source on that. It wasn't like, oh, domestication, there's a cool idea, let's go do that. Then we'll have private property, we'll have temples, we'll have armies, we'll have slavery, we'll have all these wonderful things. Of course, nobody knew that at the beginning, but people resisted it very fiercely in many, many places. And some even were able to struggle back to forager life, or hunter-gatherer life, or whatever, band society life. There's a lot of words for life outside of or before domestication, before civilization. But when you take over, when you engineer life, when you engineer, you have a wild animal, for example, you want them to be tame. Well, that's domestication, And it is, by the way, where private property comes from. I've planted this, I've weeded this, I've sweated over it, stay away. I'm going to put up a fence. This is mine. That's a new thing. It's because of domestication. There's a logic to it, but what does it lead to? All these institutions that are so estranging and lead to worse things.
You used the word symbolic. Did I hear correctly?
I don't know if I did in that context.
You can't get people to produce something symbolic, and symbolic was the adjective, unless you break them.
Oh, symbolic culture.
Symbolic culture.
Right. And in that case,
it's intriguing.
Well, Freud opted for that because he thought, well, I guess we have to cripple everybody because art is so great and people are not going to work unless they have to. I mean, it really does get back to that kind of turn, that kind of institutional choice. And that's why we're chafing under it. I mean, I think Freud was exactly right. In fact, he was probably too sanguine. People are neurotic in so many ways, and I think that's a very basic thing that you can trace it to. And maybe we'll get the chance to find out if we break the domestication. Maybe that's the end of that neurosis. That was his point.
You trace the origin of the civilization problem back to domestication and agriculture. Other authors and thinkers have traced it to writing, and more precisely alphabetic writing. What do you think about that theory?
Or cities. I think those things appear pretty rapidly, relatively speaking, but I think they're more after effects, if you will, or part of the fulfilling of the civilizational trajectory. They appear soon afterwards, but they're not. I don't think they're the operative, decisive institution that causes them. And sometimes that's not put so much for explanatory purposes, it's just maybe more for classificatory purposes. That's how we define civilization. At least some people put it that way. They're not saying that's what explains or causes civilization, but maybe some do. But I think that's not quite as basic as domestication.
Well, that pretty much wraps up it. People have questions,
I
they
disagree.
can...
If you are really an anarchist,
Look,
ask
if we... I don't want problems here. Can you go out?
I do not. I will stay.